Hello and welcome. My name's Julie McCrossan, and here we are at This Might Sting with our news roundup. And remember, we diagnose nonsense and prescribe the truth. And Dr. Aidan is with me. And Aidan, measles is back. TikTok has gone magnesium mad. Even my taxi driver wants me to use it. And the extraordinarily strange history of the CPR dummy and some gender issues. So, welcome to you. We start with measles. How could it be back?
Look, the how we know. The question is really how the hell have we let this happen again? So we'll start with basically what measles is. It's a highly contagious disease. It's one of the most contagious diseases that we're probably likely to be exposed to in our lifetimes. It's COVID on steroids when it comes to how contagious it is. You just need to be in the same room as someone and you can get it. It spreads in the air incredibly easily. It's quite airborne. And essentially, it's a disease which, for a lot of people, causes a bit of a coldy flu like symptom. Some people get this non painful, non itchy red rash that sort of starts on the face and spreads to the body. But that can be accompanied by fevers, cough, flu like symptoms, which might even start a few days before the rash. The key, though, is that it is really, really, really easy to prevent measles from becoming life threatening or disabling. And what we know is that measles is unfortunately a life-threatening and disabling disease for hundreds of thousands of people around the world who still get it, and used to be for millions of people around the world until we started vaccinating against it. And the reason we vaccinate is not to stop you getting measles, it's to stop you getting disabled or dead from measles.
And can I just ask you, are children particularly vulnerable to it or particularly at risk?
Absolutely, absolutely. So there is a condition which can occur, which is a specific kind of encephalitis. And encephal means brain, and itis means inflammation. So encephalitis means swelling of the brain. And there's a specific kind of encephalitis that kids are particularly susceptible to getting when they get measles. Now, it doesn't happen to all children, but it happens to, let's say, 1 in 1,000, potentially even 1 in 500 children, which is a lot. That's far too high, a number that I personally feel comfortable tolerating. And everyone else in public health feels the same way. Frankly, I'd like 0 in 1,000 children to get sick. This encephalitis, when you get brain swelling, comes with a host of problems. And whenever you get a serious brain swelling, there's a risk of damaging the nerves that feed into and out of the brain. So you get things like permanent intellectual disability, you get things like deafness, you get things like terrible motor coordination problems. You essentially, when you think about the fact that the spine comes into the brain and all the nerves to the ears, face, eyes, nose all come into the brain, when that brain swells up, it can squish those nerves. And on a microcellular level, it can damage structures in the brain.
Can I just ask you, before we just talk a bit more about why the resurgence is happening, I'm sure, as we all know, I'm 17 or 30.
Mm.
I'm sure I had measles. I even feel like I grew up in the 50s and I was a teenager in the 60s, born in 54. It used to be very, very common. And that was really, I'm posing that as a question, just checking my memories. But I actually can remember how uncomfortable it was. And I think it went into my eyes. And I'm one of five kids. So whether this is my memory or my memory of my younger sisters, I'm not sure. But I'm right, aren't I? It used to be very common and people were very worried about it.
Totally. So we now have the MMR vaccine, the measles, mumps, and rubella, or German measles vaccine. And there's two things which have happened. One is that as we've started to vaccinate more people, the number of people getting measles and getting the severe side effects has dropped and it's plummeted. But the second thing is the side effect of vaccines. Because remember, we're not giving vaccines to stop the disease. We're giving vaccines to stop people getting sick from the disease. But the side effect of that is that because essentially we've had such a high level of vaccination in the population, it's reduced the severity of the disease. It's turned the volume down to the point where you don't even get sick enough to start spreading it easily. And so it's just wiped measles out from most Western civilizations, which means that people just haven't contracted and spread measles much. We've had a few isolated cases over the past few years in Australia, the UK, America.
And it's back in Australia. There's lots of reports coming out of the United States. It is one of the problems, just in terms of resurgence. Obviously, we're encouraging people to get their children vaccinated, and I will ask in a minute whether adults can get it vaccination late. But is part of the problem here not just the anti-vaccination movement, which I hope is outliers here in Australia numerically, but is that we simply don't remember what it was like. I've got a memory. I have a mother, my late mother, but I heard about her rheumatic heart fever. She had tuberculosis after the Second World War and lost part of a lung. We've all got marks on our arm where we got this special vaccination if your parent had TB. So I can remember mumps, I can remember measles. As us baby boomers die out, there's a loss of living memory.
Totally. Same with polio, same with most things. When you don't remember how bad things are, you tend not to perceive them as high risk. And that's, there's an evolutionary benefit to that. It's that we're not constantly traumatized by bad things that have happened to other people or that we can't necessarily remember. But also, it's part of what makes us stupid as humans, is that we don't take things seriously when they haven't happened to us. It's an unfortunate part of the human brain. When something hasn't happened to us, we don't tend to take it nearly as seriously. Yeah, society has forgotten what it's like to have polio, to have measles, to have mumps, to have rubella, to have all these serious diseases. We've already forgotten how serious it was to die from COVID.
Well, I hope that's not true, but could I just say about polio? As a young woman, I knew people using wheelchairs because of polio. I know people now who've got late effects from polio that perhaps not all people are aware of, but if you've had it when you're young, some people have got limps now or even using wheelchairs now because of childhood polio. But I guess what you and I have got in common is this passionate commitment to evidence-based healthcare. And so that part of the population who's focused on evidence, and it's why we're doing this thing, this might sting because we're wanting to promote evidence, we do dutifully get our children vaccinated, our grandchildren vaccinated. But is that failure to vaccinate the driving force of this? That's bringing it back? Is that the primary cause?
Realistically, yes. That's the issue. And there's two issues. Issue one is I vaccinate my children because I don't want them to get sick. And issue two is I vaccinate my children because I don't want them to pass on the disease to other people. It's very difficult to ask someone to expose themselves to risk in order to protect other people. But it's part of the social contract. It's part of what we do to say, hey, I'm happy to take something which is really low risk and which will save other people's lives. But the second thing is, I get why that might be difficult for some people, but we're not asking you to vaccinate to protect other people. We're asking you to vaccinate to protect your loved ones from dying, from permanent disability. The side benefit is that by vaccinating, we increase herd immunity, and that stops the spread of disease. And that's the key, that herd immunity.
So just explain that herd immunity and why it's so crucial.
By vaccinating a critical mass of the population, we turn down the ability of the virus to sort of replicate within the body nearly as virulently or to such an extreme level. And so we stop it being able to spread nearly as effectively. And so if enough people are vaccinated, it means that the virus doesn't have an in, and maybe it infects one or two people, but it's hard to infect more than one or two people. And eventually those people will come into contact with other people who are vaccinated. And so it just can't spread nearly as much. And there are some great diagrams online of how that works mathematically.
Look, just before we leave measles, I've just literally a few days ago attended the third birthday of my grandson, my youngest child. And why I mentioned is at a third birthday, there's a pack of kids ranging in age from babies to about 6 because of the way families work. So I've just been in this swirl of children and swirl of parents who've only met in recent times because their children are going to similar childcare environments or swimming lesson environments or play activity environments. So they don't really know each other except for their kids. And I reckon that mob of people, those adults, would care about not spreading measles to their child's friends as almost as much as their own child. So I just share that little bit of optimism, even though I understand when you're a doctor, unfortunately, you see that the people who are getting into trouble because that hasn't happened. But I think we are a society in Australia that still has a strong sort of social care for each other.
Totally. There are the hotspots of anti-vaccine sentiment that we're seeing are often unfortunately associated with significant belief in alternative and complementary therapies at the expense of proper healthcare. There are no alternative means of protecting against serious diseases like measles other than vaccination. That is the treatment. There are no oils, there's no healing, there's no special thing that you can do to boost the immune system. And I hate that word, boost the immune system, because if your immune system is boosted, you get autoimmune disease. The body attacks itself. You don't want a boosted immune system. That's a bad thing. You want an appropriately regulated immune system.
So don't boost your immune system, but do
Stop.
boost This Might Sting, our podcast, by giving us feedback and by sharing it and all the rest of it. Look, let's go to our next news item for this episode. And it's a condition I've never heard of. I don't even, Tay-Sachs, I might even be not pronouncing it correctly. Help me.
No, you're spot on. It's called Tay-Sachs disease. It's a liposomal storage disease, which is medical speak. Lipo means fat, and soma means the body of the cell. So liposomal means fat inside the body of the cell. And storage disease is basically how the body takes things which it needs to store and then it pops it inside the cell. So in this case, and this is coming from a listener question asking about Tay-Sachs.
They've asked, how do I get screened for Tay-Sachs if I didn't get it in school? Well, tell
Great
me
question.
about the
So
condition and the screening.
it is a rare disease. It's particularly prevalent in specific ethnic and cultural minority groups. So in Australia, the group that has the highest rate is Ashkenazi Jewish patients or members of the community. They're not patients, they're not sick. And what happens is you essentially have two people who carry mutations of the hexa gene. And the hexa gene is a gene that tells your body how to break down fat and not stick it inside the support structure cells that sort of line up against nerves. If you can imagine, the way I like to think of it is nerves, they're kind of like a roller coaster, and you've got all those support struts, which are structures inside your brain which keep the nerves up. And there are different names for them. We often call them glial cells. And what happens in Tay-Sachs is you get massive deposits of fat in the wrong way inside your support structures and your nervous cells. And that ultimately destroys those cells' ability to communicate properly. And what that means is the electrical chain doesn't happen. You don't get the roller coaster ride of signals being carried along the nerves. And ultimately, that leads to things like movement disabilities, intellectual disability, seizures, and the brain essentially becomes more and more and more dysfunctional, and death tends to occur. So Tay-Sachs tends to be fatal. And it's an incredibly sad and unpleasant way for a child to die. And it tends to be fatal in the first few years of life. So there's a really strong rationale for screening for it because there's no real treatment. There are supporting cares, but there's no cure once a child has it. You can't undo that sort of genetic thing. And so what we do is we screen people for carrying the defective hexa gene. So if two partners who are able to procreate or have a child both have the hexa gene in a defective sort of version, we'll advise them not to have a biological child together.
I see. So the screening, it has a number of purposes, if I could put it that way. Could I just ask you, you used the term Ashkenazi Jews, and as I understand it, there are two major groupings of Jewish people, but do you want to, is it Sephardi? You tell me the names, and just quick explanation for our non-Jewish audience.
So there are Ashkenazi Jews who tend to be Jews of a European descent. So for the past sort of 600 to 800 years have been living in a diaspora community in Eastern Europe and Europe. And then there are Sephardi Jewish people who are Jewish people of a Middle Eastern and Arabic descent and who've been living in the Middle East, North Africa, and some parts of sort of Central South America for the last sort of 600 to 800 years, some of whom have been in Israel or in countries proximate to that territory.
And I think there have been some Ashkenazi or European Jews have also been in what we now call Israel.
Totally. And it's basically just describing basically the sort of ethnocultural traits of that community, and it tends to be associated with different genetic risk factors.
So our listener has said, how do I get screened for Tay-Sachs if I didn't get it at school? It's my hypothesis is that our listener may have gone to a Jewish school where this is particularly screened for. How does the Jewish community manage this?
So it's been actually a really interesting thing that's happened in Australia, which is because most other communities aren't at significant risk of this, the community themselves organizes screening and organizes screening at schools, normally around the age of 14. And there are genetic counselors who come in and screen people. And it's a very easy screening test. You just use some saliva. And what's quite cool is that they don't tell people the result. Instead, what they do to destigmatize things is that when two people want to consider having a biological child together, they both call up the genetic registry where they got tested and say, hey, we're considering having a child. And the registry will tell them what the odds are of having a child who is affected by Tay-Sachs. So you don't know which partner is necessarily a carrier, or if both partners are carriers, that's where the risk is. So both partners need to be a carrier of the gene.
And can you be screened for Tay-Sachs at any age?
Yep, absolutely.
Because I'm thinking of all those Jewish people who don't go to Jewish schools, but it's obviously well known within the community, and so you'd follow up. So what's the answer to our question? How do I get screened for Tay-Sachs if I didn't get it in school?
What you can do is, first port of call is to discuss it with your GP, and they'll be able to direct you. But also, if you just look up Tay-Sachs Screening Australia, you'll see that each state has a service provider who's able to do that screening.
And can you get it just from your private doctor, or you just go to this particular service?
Generally, it's facilitated through that specific service. You don't actually need a referral from a doctor.
Okay, maybe over time we could look at other conditions that affect just particular parts of the population. That's amazing. Look, you're listening to This Might Sting, and we're doing some newsy items. And cardiopulmonary resuscitation, also known as CPR, is back in the news in the most unusual way. It's connected to gender. I think Bond University have done some research indicating a reluctance to give CPR to women. Can you tell us a bit more about it and why this is actually a terribly important issue for women?
It's close to my heart. As a resuscitation researcher, I care passionately about CPR. We know that CPR saves lives, and the way it saves lives is that it keeps blood circulating around the body long enough to get an AED connected to someone to shock their heart back to life.
An AED?
An automatic external defibrillator. And so those portable public use, easy to use, anyone can use them. You just open the box and it'll tell you what to do. You don't need any prior training, although if you can get some, it's great. Anyone can use an AED and anyone can do CPR. You don't have to be formally trained, although it's great if you get some training. Essentially what you're doing is you're pressing hard and fast in the middle of the chest. You're compressing the chest about 1/3 of the depth, and that's to draw air into the lungs and then pump blood around the body. It isn't as good as a heart beating itself, but it's just to sustain enough blood flow so that we can hopefully shock the person's heart back, or ambulance officers and paramedics can get there to give life-saving medications to bring the person back. It doesn't always work. In fact, most of the time it doesn't work, but sometimes it does. And sometimes you can bring someone back and save their life.
And is there a kiss of life element to this?
There is. We used to give expired air rescue breaths where, I'll breathe in and then breathe out into someone else. I personally don't do that because that's yucky and I don't know the person. I work in healthcare and I don't want to catch any diseases that they have. Just doing CPR compressions is more than enough. If, a child were, worst case scenario, to be in front of me and not breathing, I would probably give them rescue breaths where I'd give them small puffs of air, 30 compressions and then 2 breaths, 2 small puffs of air, 30 compressions, 2 small puffs of air. And I'd keep doing that until help arrived or someone could put a defib on. The problem is this sometimes works and sometimes you can really save someone's life, but it's not going to work if you don't do it. And unfortunately, what we know is that women are far less likely to receive bystander CPR, which is CPR from the common person, you and I in the street, if they collapse and their heart stops beating and they stop breathing. So if someone collapses and they're unconscious and they're not breathing, they need CPR. And if you don't give them CPR, they're going to die and they're going to stay dead.
And what does the research tell us is the reasons why there's that hesitation to give it to a woman in the street?
Unfortunately, what the research is saying is that up to 40% of men think that they might be accused of sexual harassment if they expose or touch a woman's chest in order to give her CPR, which is concerning because for a number of reasons. The most important being that unfortunately means women who collapse in public are not getting CPR nearly as often as men are because there's a social perception and fear, which is such a shame.
Can I just say before you tell us your thoughts on the solutions is, first of all, I'd like to say my name's Julie. I'm 70 years old. I look like you can see me if you're on YouTube and on the screen. Do it to me if I fall down in the street. Just go for it, guys. Go for it. I've got the will to live. That was just a small advertisement for older women. But the other thing I want to say is this is so interesting because I did a little bit of reading about, and I want to say the full word because I hate acronyms, cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Cardio to do with the heart, pulmonary to do with the lungs, resuscitation, bringing us back. Why I find this extraordinary is Resusci Annie, which is the name, sometimes called CPR Annie, was created, as I understand, about 1960. So this is a mannequin doll, effectively, from the tummy up, that is used to train people, and it's still used in Australia. And the face is from a young woman who, oddly enough, was pulled from the River Seine in France in the 19th century. And she just had a lovely, serene face, as I understand it. She was chosen. And then a toy maker from Norway who saved his own son's life from drowning by turning him upside down and shaking him, and then he vomited. But it left him with this passion to save other lives. And because he ended up combining with others and developing Resusci Annie, using the sort of material he'd used for toys. But they chose a woman because their concern was, because it was mainly men in the military, mainly men in the police, and mainly men at that stage in like paramedic equivalent work, ambulance work like you're describing, they thought they'd be less likely to put their mouth on a man's mouth. It must have been when you were being encouraged to blow air. And so they chose a woman because they thought it would give more chance of the men agreeing to be trained to do it. And now all these years later, we've got this astonishing gender reversal. It just seems so ironic.
Yeah, it is. And I guess it also reflects the change in practice. We used to focus on giving rescue breaths, and now we're focusing on chest compressions. And yeah, it's an interesting change.
It is. So, did the research, or do you yourself have reflections on how we can increase the number of people willing to give CPR to women in a bystander context?
There was two sort of suggestions that have come out. One has been to increase public awareness through education, so public ad campaigns that feature females receiving CPR and people praising men who give CPR to women. The other thing has been to create more CPR mannequins with breasts, because at the moment, the vast majority of CPR mannequins are flat-chested, androgynous, or male. And so a bunch of CPR mannequin manufacturers came out and produced CPR mannequins with breasts. And of course, as you would expect, there was absolute outrage from some, frankly, I'm not going to use any descriptors, but from a section of society who had nothing better to do than to jump on a bandwagon and criticize this as a woke equality, diversity, and inclusivity stunt, which is such an idiotic, abysmal shame, because this is not about any political agenda. This is about the fact that your mum and sister and auntie are less likely to get rescued by someone in public. And if someone cannot get over themselves for 2 seconds to consider that actually this is about members of our community, 50% of the population, getting equitable access to life-saving measures, this saves lives of the people we care about. That is just the height of just selfishness to me.
Look, it's absolutely silly. I've got two quick things before we move on to our next news story. But number one is my mother did have more than one heart attack, and so I've been in heart wards in major hospitals in Sydney, and I can tell you when you walk in there, there's roughly equal numbers of men and women. So I just think that, again, you will have a comment there, but certainly my anecdotal observation is that a very significant number of women do have heart attacks. Do you want to comment on that before I tell you my other little thing?
Yeah, so I guess two comments. One is we know that actually men are more likely to get heart attacks and heart disease slightly. But the other thing is that I often find that people conflate heart attacks and cardiac arrest, and one leads to the other often. So a heart attack is a blockage in the blood vessels around your heart. It causes that chest pain, sweating, dizziness, nausea. Sometimes people often think it's that crushing chest pain, but actually what we know is that it's more of a chest discomfort, sweatiness, and feeling nauseated. That's far more likely to be a heart attack, particularly in women. It's not the stereotypical crushing chest pain that you see in the movies that men get. If that gets big enough and enough of your heart muscle dies, then you go into cardiac arrest, where there is no heartbeat, no breathing, the person's unconscious, they're not breathing, and they need CPR. And so heart attack is chest pain and a blockage to the blood vessels in your heart, and cardiac arrest is you're dying and dead, and you need CPR.
Okay, look, thank you. The other thing I just want to say is just going to this question of how do we encourage people to give necessary and essential health care or CPR, regardless of male or female or even ambiguous sexual identity, because you're focused on saving a human life. I have experience in another area of dealing with this very similar issue. We all know that breast cancer is a very common cancer for women and less so for men. And I recently attended the University of Adelaide to see the training that they do there for radiation therapists. These are the people who actually deliver the radiation. And they have a dummy. They have a whole lot of techniques, and some of them are very high tech, but they do actually have a physical dummy where they practice positioning and doing the various immobilization, as it's called, keeping us still so you can have this life-saving or life-prolonging radiation beam hit the right spot. Anyway, the lecturer, Eileen Giles, was showing me, she said, come and have a look at this. And in the box, there were a pair of very lifelike breasts on a sort of a soft rubber frame. And what they do is they put these breasts onto the mannequin so the men and the women can practice positioning a woman for breast cancer treatment, where you put your arms right back. But one of the key reasons she identified was they want to familiarise men with the total permission in a clinical context to touch the breast. Now, I do know that there are some radiation units where they will give a woman the choice, if possible, to have a setup by women, but that isn't always possible in a busy hospital, as I understand it. But anyway, there's an example where there's already an existing set of breasts that could be added to resuscitate.
Totally. And I just want to add one more thing, which is everyone thinks that breast cancer only happens to women, but it happens to men as well. And so if you're a man and there is a strange lump in your breast, it can happen to you as well. Go see your doctor.
Yeah, exactly. And I might give I took a photo of Eileen Giles and these breasts in a box. I might give it to our producer, Josh, and we can in some way connect it to our notes that we have website links and so on to give information.
Julie, why do I worry about the idea of breasts in a box?
Well, I'll pop mine in then. But look, let's move on to another story that I really am interested in, because evidently there's a huge amount on TikTok about magnesium, like magnesium mania even is occurring. And so I wanted, and I've seen it in the chemist, you go into the pharmacy and there's so many things you can buy and magnesium's always there. So what is magnesium, and is there any evidence-based merit that it's useful in promoting our well-being?
So, magnesium is a metal. It's a common metal that you find in the ground, in vegetables, in meat, and our body really needs it. It's really important. And when you combine a metal and something that's not a metal together chemically, it's called a salt. And so the magnesium that we eat is in a salt base. It is important. Your body needs magnesium. And if you have a balanced diet, you tend to get enough magnesium. It is very important to have enough magnesium in our diets because it's responsible for everything from heart health, the electrical activity in our heart, our brains, our bone regulation, the synthesis of different chemicals in our body. It's a core chemical that our body uses. And if you have enough dietarily and your stomach can absorb enough, then you're all right. The question, I guess, is if you've got a balanced diet, will you benefit from more magnesium? And like everything, it depends. There is probably a small benefit to having a small increase in magnesium for most people. because chances are we don't have enough dietary magnesium because we don't have balanced enough diets, and we're eating a lot of plain carbohydrates and sugary foods, and we're not eating enough green leafy vegetables that are rich in magnesium. That's probably the case. The thing here is that whenever we talk about something having benefit, it means that there has to come with risk as well. There's no such thing as a drug or a potion or an intervention which just has benefit and doesn't have risk. Everything in life, if it can make a difference one way, it can also make a difference the other way, which means you can have too much magnesium and you can overdose yourself on magnesium.
And what would be the detriment involved?
For starters, it can give you diarrhea and constipation. So, the forms that magnesium comes in can give you either a lot of constipation or a lot of diarrhea, depending on what the magnesium's bound to. But if you have far too much magnesium, it can start to cause toxicity, and you can literally give yourself metal poisoning from magnesium. So the trick here is, and I'm sure you'd be shocked to hear this, speak to your doctor. Now, if you're thinking, I get a few muscle cramps every now and again, I don't have any heart or health significant issues, I wonder if magnesium's good for me, you could give it a go and buy some magnesium supplements at your local pharmacy, and you could try it out for a month or two and see if it makes a difference. And if after a month or two you stop and you then notice, actually I was feeling better on it, maybe go back on it. But if you didn't notice a difference, it's probably not worthwhile spending the extra money on it. Unless you've had a chat with your GP, you've done perhaps some blood tests, or they've identified that you have a specific health condition where you would significantly benefit from magnesium. So there are some patients who have atrial fibrillation, which we mentioned in our last episode, where magnesium is a really important part of their diet, and they need high levels because it helps to stabilize the electrical signals in the heart. There are some people who have bone conditions like osteoporosis, where they are very much in need of extra magnesium and they don't have enough dietarily, and so there's a significant benefit to magnesium. It's very popular at the moment for a lot of the gym bros and people who are exercising a lot to take extra magnesium to help with muscle development and also to prevent muscle soreness. There's some evidence that has some benefit, but please take it easy. Everything in moderation.
Look, our time's up for this news, but on another occasion, I would like to talk about the role of the pharmacist in both our provision of information about medication, but also marketing, selling so many of these supplements. But let's put that for a future episode. Just before I encourage people, or might do it right now, to please send us your questions or any suggestions for topics. It was great to get one today, and I think they'll be in the notes for the show where exactly how you can do that. And please share our This Might Sting podcast if you're finding it interesting and great, so that more people get to know about it. But do you want to give us one health tip, either arising from our discussions today or just in general, that you'd like to share with our audience?
The best thing you can do for back pain is to move. Chronic lower back pain is one of the number one most disabling conditions in our population. And it's caused by a whole host of things, which basically comes down to muscle spasms, pressing on your nerves, because there's essentially a degeneration in the strength of the spine at its base. And it's caused by a bit of osteoarthritis, a bit of aging, a bit of muscle soreness, and people suffer. They suffer big time from lower back pain. And the best thing you can do for lower back pain is to keep moving around, warming up those muscles so they start getting blood into them and rubbing together is the treatment.
I want you
Don't
to
lie down.
Don't lie down. Dr. Aidan, I want you to know that I spent a good hour with two fellow elderly people this week with my exercise physiologist doing all manner of things. My tip is, when you get a vaccination, it might sting, but it also might save your life. So go for vaccines, because I'm in the generation that does remember so many different things. I'll just quickly say, I mentioned tuberculosis with my late mum, but I grew up with a mum who had a scar. I know some of you can see my hands. Honestly, it was about 3/4 of an inch, and it went from the top of her shoulder completely across her back, like Zorro had gone like that. And it was because Mum had one of the first, half a lung was taken out, a lobectomy. It was called radical surgery back then in about 1946. So when you've grown up with that, you're keen on vaccinations. And that's just an old dag sharing a bit of information. But thank you to you, Dr. Aidan, and to our listeners, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Julie. And for anyone listening, just remember to like and subscribe to This Might Sting. We are diagnosing nonsense and prescribing the truth. Have a great one.
This Might Sting is hosted by Aidan Barron and Julie McCrossan. Executive produced by Joshua Kirsch. While we always work to give you the best information and tips, nothing in This Might Sting should be construed as personal healthcare advice. You should always make health decisions in consultation with your general practitioner and specialists. If you'd like to hear us talk about a topic on the show, or if you think we've made a mistake and want to request a correction, please contact us at questions@thismightsting.com.au.